Welcome to NewsClick. We are with Professor Hock for the second part of our interview on the linguistic issues in India.
Students, it's not likely that people made a trip of 1,000 miles to have conjugal visits. But what's important is it does point to an area which is probably at the intersection more or less between South Asia and Iran. At least that's a kind of compromise, between these two views. And it is true then that Europe gets settled through some of the genetic strains which existed in South Asia. But that is, again, at the time of the so-called peopling of Eurasia. That gets us back to a time, by different estimates, between 20 and 40,000 BC. Long before we know anything about any language which might have been spoken anywhere. So this supports nothing of the sort. But these studies, at least one of these studies then, the authors remarked at the end that yes, there is no direct evidence for an Aryan migration. However, the evidence does not exclude this because they point to the fact that there is this notion of elite dominance, where a small group of people can come and where for various social, cultural, political reasons there is pressure on the local population to adopt that language. A classical case, which again now is done actually on genomic grounds, is Turkey. If you look at Turks, they don't look very different from Greeks. Don't tell a Turk that, or a Greek. They don't like that. They like to be different. But the study which was done showed that 1.5% of the Turkish population, only 1.5, can be traced to Central Asia. But Turkish, as a language, comes from Central Asia. So that's a time interval of maybe 700 years or so. If there was an arrival of Indo-Aryan speakers in South Asia, somewhere in the second millennium BC, that would be almost 4,000 years back. So little of a trace remains than what you'd expect after 4,000 years. So the point is that if you are being completely honest about this, you have to say there is no evidence one way or the other. And then the other thing is that we know that in historical times there were Sakas, Hunas, Greeks, all kinds of other people arriving. They didn't change the skeletal mix. So again, it shows that the whole idea that people have that there should be a clear signature isn't there.
So effectively what you're really saying is that we should not project back into the past what are really considerations of today or 19th century, ethnicity, nationalism, invasions, really movements and migrations of people should not be confused with invasions. And number two, the numbers would in any case have been much smaller, while the languages could have moved much more, but the number of people moving are relatively less. And the third point is that the simpler hypothesis would be a single migration into India rather than multiple migrations, which is what would be required to explain the large spread of Indo-Aryan languages.
And there is some rather complex evidence on the linguistic side, which again goes in the same direction. Again, it's a circumstantial argument, but some people at least would be willing to say, well, we have two lines of argument pointing in the same direction. We should pay some attention to that. Now, you asked another question earlier that has to do with the question of the relationship between Sanskrit and other Indian languages. First of all, it's curious that most people who talk about this talk mainly about Sanskrit and Dravidian. And even in Dravidian, they talk about the literary languages. The tribal languages are basically being erased. And that is, I think, a problem because clearly there are other language groups in South Asia. And there are indications here and there that there may have been yet other groups. So one of our colleagues here at JNU has done work on the Andaman Islands, and there are two different linguistic groups there, she finds. And as far as she or anybody else can tell, there is no compelling evidence to align them with any other languages. which suggests, together with, say, Burushaski up way north and Kusunda somewhere in Nepal, that there may have been many, many other such languages floating around, and they're simply being ignored. Now, this is one issue, but the other issue is, can Dravidian be derived from Sanskrit? Now, Dravidian has taken lots of words from Sanskrit. Modern Hindi has taken lots of words from English. That doesn't make English the mother tongue, the source for modern Hindi.
Lot of Hindi words are into English as well.
Yeah,
Bazaar
but I mean,
and so
I'm just focusing on this, because people always like to look at the language of power,
Hierarchy.
yeah, right. So the point is, I'm amused by this. My wife recently was talking to a friend and was saying, "Galam dedo," and she started laughing. She said, "Why are you laughing? Nobody says galam anymore. What do you say? Ben, right?" So there is this almost gratuitous use of English words, which is taking place more and more. That doesn't make Hindi, however, English. It's still quintessentially Hindi. If you know English, you can't speak Hindi, and vice versa. Now, as far as Dravidian and Indo-Aryan or Sanskrit are concerned, this is sometimes also made out to be a politically or ideologically motivated kind of issue. So people like to focus on Bishop. They always call him Bishop Caldwell, who did write the first comparative grammar of Dravidian languages. And they say, you see, it was missionary colonial interests which led to this idea that this is a completely separate language. Well, the true story has been told by Trotman, an interesting book. And he points out to the fact that there were two schools among the British colonialists. One at Fort St. George, the other at Fort William. One, based on the information they got from their pundits, argued that Dravidian and Sanskrit must go back to different sources, as their different ancestors, and the other one claimed the opposite. That raises the interesting question, if bias and so forth plays a role, if foreigners, colonialists, ipso facto will come up with theories in order to divide the Indians, why did only one set of the, of the colonialists do this? Or put differently, who are the good guys and bad guys here? How do we decide? Because they did something we agree with or not? Well, ultimately, as in all these cases, what should decide matters is the empirical evidence. And the empirical evidence is very strong that there is a major distinction between Sanskrit and its other relatives outside of India, on one hand, and the Dravidian languages. So take, for instance, in Sanskrit, the word for I, the nominative case is aham. Accusative, mam. English, I, me. Similar forms in Greek and Latin. Now, this kind of phenomenon that you have a different root for one form of a word and yet a different root for another form, that's highly unusual. And the fact that these agree with each other in their phonetics, phonology, makes it even harder to believe that this is pure accident. Linguists would say this is prima facie evidence that they must go back to a common ancestor. Nothing of that sort is found in Dravidian. Dravidian has its own idiosyncrasies. For instance, early on in Dravidian, you couldn't simply say father. You had to say my father, your father, his father, her father. So it wouldn't be dai, it would be yendai, my father, dandai, his father, and so forth. So clearly, that is something which Indo-European didn't do. So again, you find this, when you look at details of structure and vocabulary, and the structure of the vocabulary, then you find that these are very different languages. That doesn't mean they are not ultimately related, but if they are related at a time much, much farther back, where Proto-Indo-European and Dravidian and who knows what other languages may have been related to each other. There are some people who claim these things. There's something called Nostratic, very ethnocentric kind of thing, because it means, Nostra means our. It's from our part of the world, right? But okay, leave aside the name. People who argue for this, I think, are very serious about it, but many of us in historical linguistics are doubtful as to whether the evidence they have is sufficient to establish the relationships they postulate.
Basically, on the face of it, we have to say that what Bishop Caldwell did is supported by current empirical evidence.
Yes, and what the school in Fort St. George did, and not the school in Fort Williams. Right. I mean, of course, but then, you have to think about it. When people start doing something, there are all kinds of false steps. So they didn't get everything right, even the ones who were on the right track. They didn't get everything right. Caldwell didn't get everything right either. There's a lot more work which has been done since then, and some things have to be changed. But there has been nothing in linguistic research which has contradicted the basic idea that these are different language families.
Thank you, Professor Hock. This has been an extremely interesting discussion. I hope to see you in India more and continue our discussions in the future.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.